The champagne glass in Veronica's perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she laughed at something my husband said, but her confident smile never wavered. Not until Detective Captain Alexander Reeves, my older brother, walked through the mahogany doors of the Rosewood Country Club's grand ballroom, his badge glinting under the crystal chandeliers. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. I'm Elena Caldwell, and this is how my husband's mistress went from smugly flaunting their affair at our 10th wedding anniversary party to begging for mercy when she realized she'd been sleeping with a man my brother had been investigating for federal crimes for the past 8 months. Before we dive into this story that will leave you speechless, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if tales of karma and justice get your blood pumping, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind even more. The irony of discovering my husband's betrayal at our own anniversary celebration wasn't lost on me, but what happened next turned a personal catastrophe into the most satisfying night of my life. You see, while I'd been planning what I thought was a romantic evening to rekindle our marriage, Veronica Ashworth, the stunning marketing director from David's pharmaceutical company, had been planning something entirely different. "Elena, darling!" Veronica had approached me earlier that evening, her emerald dress hugging her curves perfectly, her smile radiating false warmth. "You look absolutely radiant tonight. David is so lucky to have such a devoted wife." The way she emphasized devoted should have been my first clue, but I was too focused on making sure everything was perfect for our guests. The Rosewood Country Club was the most exclusive venue in Millbrook Heights, and I'd spent months planning every detail of this celebration. "Thank you, Veronica," I'd replied, adjusting the white roses in the centerpiece. "I'm so glad you could make it. David speaks so highly of your work at Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals." Her laugh was like silver bells with a hint of mockery. "Oh, David and I work very closely together." "Very closely." The way her eyes sparkled when she said it made my stomach clench, though I couldn't quite understand why at the time. Throughout the evening, I watched as Veronica moved through our party like she owned it. She knew exactly where everything was: the bathroom, the coat check, even the private balcony that I'd specifically requested for intimate photos with David. She complimented our choice of wine, mentioned how cozy our house must be, and somehow knew that David preferred his scotch neat, not on the rocks. How does she know so much about our preferences? I'd whispered to my best friend Charlotte, who was helping me coordinate the evening. Charlotte's face had darkened. "Elena, honey, we need to talk." But before she could elaborate, the evening's carefully orchestrated facade began to crumble in the most unexpected way. David had been acting strangely all week: nervous phone calls, late nights at the office, and an unusual interest in our anniversary guest list. When I'd mentioned that my brother Alexander would be attending, David's face had gone pale. "Your brother, the detective? I thought he was working that big case." "He is, but he promised he'd make time for our anniversary. You know how important family is to Alex." What I didn't know then was that David's nervousness had nothing to do with impressing my brother, and everything to do with the fact that Alexander had been building a federal case against Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals for illegal drug trials, falsified research data, and distribution of unapproved medications to vulnerable patients. The first crack in Veronica's confidence appeared when she spotted Alexander's unmarked police car pulling into the country club's circular driveway. I watched from the window as her champagne glass slipped slightly in her grasp, and she quickly scanned the room for David. "Elena," she said, appearing beside me with forced casualness, "that gentleman getting out of the car, is he a friend of yours?" "That's my brother, Alexander. He's a detective captain with the Metropolitan Police. Why do you ask?" The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. "Oh, no reason. Just curious about your family." But curiosity had nothing to do with the panic that flashed across her features. Unknown to me at the time, Veronica wasn't just David's mistress. She was his partner in a scheme that had been defrauding insurance companies and endangering patients' lives. While I'd been planning romantic dinners and anniversary parties, they'd been planning how to cover their tracks in a federal investigation. When Alexander walked through those mahogany doors in his perfectly tailored navy suit, his detective's eyes immediately swept the room with professional assessment. He was off duty, but 20 years in law enforcement had trained him to notice things others missed, like the way certain people suddenly became very interested in their phones or started gravitating toward the exits. "Elena!" Alexander's warm voice boomed across the ballroom as he approached with his arms open for a hug. "Sorry I'm late, little sister. You know how it is with the Pinnacle case." "Oh." He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze fixing on something behind me. I turned to see Veronica frozen like a deer in headlights, her champagne glass now openly shaking in her hand. "Well, well," Alexander said quietly, his tone shifting from brotherly warmth to professional interest. "Veronica Ashworth, fancy meeting you here. Now the story is moving towards its true beginning, so stay with us and don't skip any parts, and fast forward. The next development is incredibly compelling." That's when Veronica's confident smile finally cracked completely, and I realized that my anniversary party was about to become something much more dramatic than I'd ever imagined. The woman who'd been smugly flaunting her affair with my husband had no idea she'd just walked into a trap 8 months in the making, and my detective brother was about to serve justice with a side of champagne and wedding cake. What happens next will shock you. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. The tension in the Rosewood Country Club's ballroom was thick enough to cut with a knife as Alexander's professional gaze locked onto Veronica, but what happened in the next 20 minutes revealed a web of deception so intricate that my husband's affair was just the tip of the iceberg. "Detective Reeves," Veronica stammered, attempting to regain her composure while her champagne glass continued its telltale trembling. "What a surprise to see you here." "I'm sure it is," Alexander replied, his voice carrying that particular tone I'd heard him use during interrogations. "Elena, would you mind if I borrowed your friend for a moment? I believe Ms. Ashworth and I have some mutual acquaintances to discuss." That's when David appeared, seemingly from nowhere, his face flushed and panicked. "Elena! There you are! I was looking everywhere for you!" His eyes darted between Alexander and Veronica, like a trapped animal seeking escape routes. "David Caldwell," Alexander extended his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Elena's mentioned you work at Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals. Interesting company. We've been having quite a few conversations about their business practices lately." I watched my husband's face cycle through confusion, recognition, and pure terror in the span of 3 seconds. "Oh, you're the detective Elena mentioned. The one working on cases." "The Pinnacle case specifically," Alexander confirmed, never breaking eye contact. "Though I have to say, seeing you both here tonight certainly adds an interesting dimension to our investigation." That's when the pieces started clicking into place for me, though the full picture was still horrifyingly unclear. Veronica's intimate knowledge of our home wasn't just from David's pillow talk. She'd been casing our lifestyle, our connections, our vulnerabilities. My husband's recent stress wasn't just guilt over an affair. It was fear of federal prosecution. "Elena, sweetheart," David's voice cracked slightly as he reached for my hand, "maybe we should check on the caterers. Make sure everything's running smoothly." But I was transfixed by the scene unfolding before me. Veronica had gone from confident mistress to cornered criminal in less than 5 minutes, and my brother's presence had triggered a panic response that spoke to crimes far beyond adultery. "Actually," Charlotte appeared at my elbow, her voice unusually tight, "Elena, I think there's something you should see, now." She led me toward the country club's business center, where she'd apparently been doing some detective work of her own. "I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Veronica tonight," she explained, pulling out her phone. So I did some digging while you were greeting guests. What she showed me made my blood run cold. Article after article about Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals' recent troubles. FDA investigations, patient deaths linked to unapproved drug trials, falsified research data, and millions in insurance fraud. And there, in a company directory she'd found online, were photos of the key players under investigation. David Caldwell, Senior Research Director; Veronica Ashworth, Marketing Director and Public Relations. "Charlotte," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the party's background noise, "are you telling me that my husband and his mistress are federal criminals?" "Elena, it gets worse." She scrolled to another article, this one detailing how Pinnacle had been using fake patient data to get experimental drugs approved, then billing insurance companies for treatments that never actually helped anyone. "Look at the timeline. This investigation has been going on for 8 months. Your brother's been tracking them this entire time." The room spun slightly as the implications hit me. Every late night David claimed to be working, every business dinner he couldn't skip, every time Veronica had shown up at company events with that knowing smile. They weren't just having an affair. They were partners in a criminal enterprise that had literally cost people their lives. "How many patients?" I asked, dreading the answer. 17 confirmed deaths from their fake cancer treatment trials, hundreds more who got sicker because they thought they were receiving real medication. My anniversary party had just transformed from a celebration of marriage into the scene of a federal investigation, and the woman who'd been sleeping with my husband had blood on her hands. I looked back toward the ballroom, where Alexander was now speaking quietly into his phone while keeping both David and Veronica in his line of sight. Other guests were beginning to notice the tension, though they had no idea they were witnessing the convergence of a major federal case. "Elena," Charlotte gripped my arm, "there's something else. I found records of payments from a shell company to a private investigator. They've been having you followed for months." "What?" The betrayal cut even deeper than I thought possible. "They needed to make sure you didn't accidentally stumble onto their operation. Veronica suggested it, said they needed to monitor the, quote, detective sister to ensure you couldn't compromise their timeline." The woman who'd smiled at me so sweetly tonight, who'd complimented my dress and my party planning, who'd been sleeping with my husband in what I thought was just a sordid affair. She'd been treating me like a security threat in a criminal conspiracy. My phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Don't react. Don't let them know you know. We need them to think everything is normal until backup arrives. Can you keep playing hostess for another hour?" I looked across the ballroom at David, who was now sweating through his expensive suit, and Veronica, who kept glancing toward the exits like a caged animal. They thought they were just dealing with an inconvenient family connection to law enforcement. They had no idea that their entire world was about to collapse, and that the devoted wife they'd both underestimated was about to become their worst nightmare. Because while they'd been planning their crimes and their affair, they'd forgotten one crucial detail. Betraying a detective sister isn't just personal. It's evidence. Standing in the business center of the Rosewood Country Club, surrounded by printouts of my husband's criminal activities and evidence of a federal investigation that had been happening right under my nose, I faced the most important decision of my life. Every instinct screamed at me to march back into that ballroom and confront David and Veronica in front of all our guests, to scream about the affair, the lies, the deaths they'd caused. But as I stared at my brother's text message asking me to keep playing hostess, a different plan began forming in my mind. So stick with us and don't to skip or speed up the story. What happens next is absolutely riveting. "Charlotte," I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest, "how long would it take you to print everything you just showed me?" "Elena, what are you thinking?" She studied my face with growing concern. "You have that look you used to get right before you do something crazy in college." "Not crazy," I corrected, my mind racing through possibilities. "Strategic. David and Veronica think they're dealing with an inconvenient coincidence." My brother showing up at a party where they happen to be. They don't know that I know anything about their crimes, their affair, or the fact that they've been having me followed. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through months of text messages from David. Late nights at the office, emergency meetings, business trips with the marketing team. Every lie was documented in black and white, and now I understood the real context behind each deception. They think I'm still the naive wife who plans anniversary parties and doesn't ask too many questions, I continued, feeling a cold clarity settle over me. What if we let them keep thinking that? Charlotte's eyes widened. Elena, your brother is conducting a federal investigation. This isn't some marital dispute you can handle with a dramatic confrontation. Exactly. I turned back toward the ballroom, where I could see David and Veronica through the glass doors, both still trapped in conversation with Alexander, while other party guests mingled obliviously around them. Alexander needs evidence, right? Solid, irrefutable proof that will stick in federal court? Well, yes, but... And who has better access to their private communications, their schedules, their unguarded moments, than the wife they think is too stupid to notice what's happening right in front of her face? The realization hit Charlotte at the same time it crystallized in my own mind. You want to go undercover in your own marriage. I want to give my brother everything he needs to make sure they never hurt another patient, never steal another dollar, and never walk free again. I felt something shift inside me, a transformation from victim to operative. David's been treating me like I'm invisible for months. Veronica's been playing games with me, thinking she's so much smarter than the devoted wife. Let them keep underestimating me. My phone buzzed again. Alexander, backup ETA 45 minutes. Need you to keep them here and act normal. Can you do this? Instead of responding immediately, I walked back toward the ballroom, Charlotte close behind me. Through the ornate glass doors, I could see the scene that would have devastated me an hour ago. My husband and his mistress standing too close together, their body language screaming intimacy despite their obvious panic about Alexander's presence. But now, instead of heartbreak, I felt something much more powerful, purpose. Elena, Charlotte grabbed my arm as we reached the doors. Are you absolutely sure about this? Once you start down this path, there's no going back. You'll be living a lie until the investigation concludes. I thought about the 17 patients who died believing they were receiving real cancer treatment. I thought about the hundreds more who'd gotten sicker while David and Veronica collected insurance payments for fake medications. I thought about every night I'd waited up for my husband, worried about his stress level, while he was actually planning crimes with his mistress. I've already been living a lie, I said firmly. The only difference is now I know the truth, and I'm going to use it. I typed my response to Alexander. I can do more than keep them here. I can get you everything you need from the inside. Trust me. His reply came quickly. Elena, this could be dangerous. They've already shown they're willing to have you surveilled. They're surveilling someone they think is harmless. Let me show them exactly how harmless the detective's sister can be. Charlotte looked at me with a mixture of admiration and terror. What exactly are you planning? Phase 1. Get through tonight without arousing suspicion. Play the perfect anniversary party hostess while your boyfriend gathers evidence from the outside. I straightened my shoulders, checking my reflection in the glass door. Phase 2. Become the wife David thinks he married. Supportive, trusting, eager to help with his work. Get access to files, communications, meetings. And Phase 3? A cold smile spread across my face as I watched Veronica lean closer to David, probably planning their next move or their escape strategy. Phase 3. Make sure they're both in the same room when Alexander serves those arrest warrants, preferably somewhere public, where everyone can see exactly who they really are. I pushed open the ballroom doors, immediately shifting into performance mode. The grieving wife discovering her husband's affair would have to wait. Tonight I was going to be Elena Caldwell, federal informant. Darling! I called out brightly as I approached David and Veronica, who both turned toward me with visible relief. They thought my return meant safety, normalcy, the end of their immediate panic. They had no idea I'd just declared war. "Sorry to abandon you both. Alexander was just telling me about his work." "It sounds so fascinating. David, you should definitely get his advice about those new compliance procedures at Pinnacle. I'm sure Alexander would love to hear about your innovative approaches to drug development." The look of pure terror that flashed across both their faces was worth every lie I was about to tell for the next however many weeks this investigation would take. Because they thought they'd been playing games with Elena, the anniversary party planner. Now they were about to meet Elena, the federal informant, and she played for keeps. The morning after our anniversary party, I sat at my kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee and a secure phone that Alexander had discreetly slipped me during his goodbye hug. David was upstairs in the shower, probably scrubbing off the nervous sweat from last night's close call, while I prepared to build the most important network of my life. "Elena," Alexander's voice crackled through the encrypted device, "before we go any further, I need you to understand what you're signing up for. This isn't just about catching David and Veronica anymore. Our investigation has uncovered connections to a much larger pharmaceutical fraud ring operating across 3 states. I gripped the phone tighter, watching steam rise from my coffee mug like smoke signals of war. How much larger? We're talking about at least 6 companies, dozens of executives, and potentially hundreds of deaths. Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals isn't just one bad apple. It's part of an entire orchard that's been poisoning people for profit." The weight of that revelation settled over me like a heavy blanket. And David and Veronica? Middle management in a criminal empire. But here's the thing. They have access to communications and files that could help us bring down the whole network. Your position as David's wife makes you our best asset for gathering that intelligence. After ending the call, I began reaching out to the people who would become my secret coalition. First on my list was Dr. Rebecca Martinez, my former college roommate who now worked as a medical ethics consultant. If anyone could help me understand the full scope of what David and Veronica had done, it would be her. "Elena?" Rebecca's voice was warm with surprise when I called. "It's been months. How are you? How was the anniversary party?" "Rebecca, I need your help with something confidential, something that could save lives." The tone of my voice must have communicated the seriousness of the situation because her response was immediate. "Whatever you need, when and where." We met that afternoon at Millbrook Heights Public Library, in the medical research section, where our conversation would blend naturally with the academic atmosphere. Rebecca listened without interruption as I laid out everything I'd learned about Pinnacle's fake clinical trials and falsified data. "Jesus, Elena," she whispered, reviewing the documents I'd printed. "These aren't just ethics violations. This is mass murder disguised as medicine." She looked up at me with haunted eyes. "I actually know some of the patients mentioned in these files. They came to me for second opinions after their Pinnacle treatments failed." "They came to you?" My heart clenched. "Rebecca, did you try to report anything suspicious?" "I filed complaints with the FDA, but they get thousands of reports. Individual cases don't always trigger investigations." Her voice grew bitter. "If I'd known there was a pattern, if I'd seen the scope of what they were doing." "You can help stop it now," I interrupted gently. "Alexander needs medical experts who can interpret the data they're gathering. People who understand how clinical trials are supposed to work versus what Pinnacle was actually doing." Rebecca's eyes hardened with determination. "Count me in. But Elena, you need to know, if this goes to trial, they'll need patients and families willing to testify. Are you prepared for what that might look like?" Her question led me to my next ally, Thomas Brennan, an investigative journalist who'd been following pharmaceutical fraud cases for the past decade. I'd found his contact information through Rebecca's professional network, and his reputation for protecting sources while exposing corporate corruption made him perfect for what I needed. "Mrs. Caldwell," Thomas said, when we met at a small cafe outside Millbrook Heights, Dr. Martinez gave me a brief overview of your situation. I have to ask, why come to a journalist instead of just working with the police? Because when this breaks, and it will break, I want to make sure the public understands exactly what these people did. I want their victims' stories told properly, and I want the families to know they're not alone. Thomas leaned forward, his reporter's instincts clearly engaged. What kind of access do you have to internal documents? David works from home 2 days a week. His office is right next to our bedroom. I showed him photos I'd taken of David's filing system and computer setup. Plus, Veronica has been coming to our house for what she thinks are discreet meetings. She has no idea I know about the affair, so she doesn't try to hide anything when I'm supposedly out running errands. And the federal investigation? My brother is leading it, but he's limited by what he can legally obtain through warrants and subpoenas. I can access communications and documents that might never surface through official channels. Thomas nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Help documenting everything, creating a paper trail that the public will be able to follow when this story breaks, and I hesitated, then pushed forward. Help finding the patients and families who deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. The third member of my growing alliance came from an unexpected source. That evening, as I was preparing dinner and David was in his office on what he thought was a private call with Veronica, my doorbell rang. Standing on my front porch was Margaret Chen, no relation to the Chen family from before, a woman in her 60s, wearing a simple black dress and carrying a manila folder. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm Margaret Chen. My husband participated in one of your husband's clinical trials 6 months ago. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held a pain that made my chest ache. He died last week. Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry for your loss, but I think there might be some confusion. There's no confusion. She opened the folder, revealing medical records and correspondence with Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals. My husband believed he was receiving cutting-edge cancer treatment. Instead, according to his autopsy, he was given sugar pills while his cancer spread unchecked. My blood ran cold. How did you find out? A nurse at the hospital where he died. She couldn't officially say anything, but she made sure I knew to request specific tests during the autopsy. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Mrs. Caldwell, I know what your husband and that woman have been doing. I've been gathering evidence from other families, other patients. We're organized and we're angry. How many families? 43 so far, and growing every day. We call ourselves the Pinnacle Truth Coalition. She handed me a business card with a phone number and email address. We know about the federal investigation. We know about your brother. And we know you're in a position to help us get justice. Standing in my doorway, looking at this woman who'd lost her husband to my husband's greed, I realized that my personal betrayal was just one small piece of a much larger tragedy. But it was also the key to bringing down the entire system. Mrs. Chen, I said, stepping aside to let her in, let's talk about how we're going to make sure David and Veronica pay for what they've done to all of us. Because while David thought he was just hiding an affair from his naive wife, he had no idea that his wife was now connected to federal agents, medical experts, investigative journalists, and 43 families who wanted justice. His world was about to get much smaller and much more dangerous. 3 weeks into my double life as both devoted wife and federal informant, I had transformed our home into the most sophisticated surveillance operation David and Veronica could never have imagined. While they thought they were conducting their affair and criminal conspiracy in the safety of familiar surroundings, I was systematically documenting every conversation, every document, and every incriminating detail of their operation. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when David received what he thought was a private call in his home office. I was supposedly in the garden planting fall bulbs, but the audio equipment Alexander had helped me install was capturing every word through the heating vents that connected our bedroom to his office space. Veronica, we need to accelerate the Phoenix timeline. David's voice crackled through my earpiece as I knelt among the chrysanthemums, my hands working the soil while my mind recorded every detail. The Martinez family is asking too many questions about Roberto's autopsy results. How much do they know? Veronica's voice was tight with worry, even through the phone connection. Enough to be dangerous. We need to transfer the remaining files from the Phoenix trial to the offshore servers before anyone can subpoena them. Can you handle the data migration this weekend? The story is finally reaching its real ending, so please stay with us and watch at normal speed. You won't want to miss what's coming because it gets really interesting from here. My blood chilled as I realized they were discussing Roberto Martinez, Margaret Chen's nephew, whose family had contacted me just days ago through the Pinnacle Truth Coalition. They weren't just covering up past crimes, they were actively destroying evidence while more families suffered. That afternoon, while David was at what he claimed was a quote, routine board meeting, but which I knew was actually a strategy session with other Pinnacle executives, I accessed his home computer using the password I'd observed him typing during one of his private calls with Veronica. What I found exceeded even Alexander's worst expectations. The Phoenix trial files contained documentation of over 300 patients across 7 facilities, all of whom had been given placebo treatments while being charged for experimental cancer therapies. But worse than the scope was the systematic nature of their deception. Detailed spreadsheets tracking which patients were most likely to die quickly to minimize family questioning, which insurance companies were slowest to investigate claims, and which hospitals had staff members willing to falsify records for additional payments. I photographed every page, every spreadsheet, every email chain, using the specialized camera equipment Thomas Brennan had provided. But as I worked, I discovered something that made my hands shake with rage. Patient profiles that included detailed family information, including which relatives worked in law enforcement, journalism, or had medical backgrounds that might make them more likely to investigate suspicious deaths. My own name appeared in a file labeled Security Risks Ongoing Monitoring. Veronica had compiled a dossier on me that included my work schedule, my friendship with Charlotte, my shopping patterns, and detailed notes about my brother's career with the Metropolitan Police. They hadn't just been having me followed, they'd been studying me like a potential threat to be neutralized. The most chilling entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. Subject remains unaware of operation. Recommend continued standard protocols unless behavior changes significantly. Note: subject's emotional attachment to anniversary celebration, successfully utilized to maintain cover during Detective Reeves' encounter. They had manipulated my love for my marriage, my desire to create a perfect anniversary celebration, as part of their security strategy. Every romantic gesture I'd planned, every detail I'd agonized over, had been part of their calculation for keeping me distracted while they literally killed people for profit. That evening, I met Dr. Rebecca Martinez at Riverside General Hospital, where she'd arranged for me to speak with Dr. Patricia Wolf, the chief of oncology who'd been noticing disturbing patterns in patient outcomes from Pinnacle trials. Elena, what Rebecca shared with me about your situation, it explains so much, Dr. Wolf said as we sat in her office, medical charts spread across her desk. We've had 17 patients transferred here from Pinnacle facilities in the past 6 months. All of them came to us in critical condition, after supposedly receiving cutting-edge treatments that should have stabilized or improved their conditions. What did you find when you examined them? No trace of the medications they'd supposedly been receiving. Their cancer markers indicated they'd received no treatment whatsoever, for weeks or months. Dr. Wolf's voice grew heavy with controlled anger. These people came to us believing they were getting the best possible care. Instead, they'd been systematically poisoned with false hope while their diseases progressed unchecked. She pulled out a thick folder of medical records. I've been documenting everything, but without proof of systematic fraud, it just looked like individual treatment failures. What you're showing me, the deliberate nature of this deception, it changes everything. Dr. Wolf, would you be willing to testify about what you've observed? Elena, I'll do more than testify. I'll help you understand exactly how they've been manipulating medical data to hide their crimes. She opened her laptop, pulling up a database I'd never seen before. Rebecca suggested you might need help interpreting some of the technical aspects of what your husband has been doing. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Wolf walked me through the sophisticated methods David and Veronica had been using to falsify clinical trial data. They hadn't just been giving patients sugar pills instead of real medication. They'd been actively manipulating blood tests, imaging results, and progress reports to make it appear that ineffective treatments were showing promise. This isn't just fraud, Dr. Wolf explained, pointing to manipulated lab results that showed cancer markers decreasing when patients were actually dying. This is torture. These families watched their loved ones suffer, believing that the suffering was part of a treatment that would ultimately save them. Later that night, I transmitted everything to Alexander through our secure communication channel, including the Phoenix trial files, the patient manipulation protocols, and Dr. Wolf's medical analysis. His response came back within an hour. Elena, this is enough to bring down the entire network. But we need one more piece: proof of the financial structure. Can you get access to their banking records? I looked across our bedroom at David, who was sleeping peacefully beside me, completely unaware that his wife had just handed federal investigators enough evidence to destroy his life and the lives of everyone involved in their criminal conspiracy. Tomorrow was Friday. Veronica always came to the house on Friday afternoons for what David thought were private strategy sessions. But this Friday, while they planned their next moves in our living room, I would be in David's office photographing their financial records and documenting the money trail that funded their empire of death. Because while they thought they were just two criminals in love, hiding their affair and their crimes from a naive wife, they were actually performing their conspiracy in front of the most motivated and well-equipped intelligence-gathering operation they would ever encounter. And tomorrow, I was going to get them both exactly where Alexander needed them to be. The Friday afternoon meeting I'd been planning turned into the most terrifying 3 hours of my life when David and Veronica's paranoia reached a breaking point, and I realized that my cover as the oblivious wife was beginning to crack under the pressure of their growing desperation. I was in David's office, photographing the final batch of financial records while they conducted their strategy session in the living room below, when Veronica's voice cut through the house with an edge I'd never heard before. David, we have a problem. A big one. I froze, camera halfway to another document, as footsteps moved rapidly across the hardwood floors downstairs. Through the baby monitor I'd hidden in a flower arrangement, ostensibly for security but actually for surveillance, I could hear every word with crystal clarity. What kind of problem? David's voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd been fielding crisis after crisis for weeks. 3 more families contacted lawyers yesterday, all Phoenix trial patients, all asking specifically about falsified lab results and placebo medications. Veronica's heels clicked against the floor in agitated pacing. David, they're using terminology that only someone with inside knowledge would know. My blood turned to ice as I realized they were talking about the families from Margaret Chen's coalition. Families I'd been secretly helping to connect with legal representation through Thomas Brennan's network of contacts. How could they possibly know about the placebo protocols? David's voice rose dangerously. Those documents are classified at the highest levels. Even our own research staff didn't have access to the full scope. That's what worries me, Veronica replied, and I could hear her settling into one of our living room chairs. The same chair where she'd sat countless times, smiling at me while planning her next move with my husband. Someone with high-level access is feeding them information. I carefully set down the camera and crept to the top of the stairs, where I could better hear their conversation while still being positioned to retreat to the office if they came upstairs. You think we have a leak inside Pinnacle? David asked. I think we have a leak somewhere, and it's getting worse every day. David, yesterday I received a call from Senator Harrison's office. They're launching a congressional inquiry into pharmaceutical fraud, specifically targeting companies with patterns of patient deaths following experimental treatments. The sound of glass clinking told me David was pouring himself a drink, probably from the whiskey decanter I'd given him for Christmas last year. congressional inquiry? How is that possible? We've been careful about political contributions, made sure all the right people were taken care of. Apparently not careful enough. Someone's been feeding them very specific information about our operations. Information that could only come from someone with access to our highest level communications. I heard footsteps moving toward the kitchen, and panic flooded my system as I realized David might be coming upstairs. I quickly retreated to his office, closing the door to just a crack and positioning myself behind his desk, where I could appear to be dusting or organizing if he walked in. But instead of coming upstairs, his voice carried from the kitchen, closer now to the baby monitor's pickup range. "Veronica, we need to consider the possibility that Elena knows something." My heart stopped completely. "Elena?" Veronica's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "David, your wife can barely manage a dinner party without detailed notes. You think she's capable of orchestrating a federal investigation?" "Think about it." David's voice grew more animated as he apparently paced the kitchen. "The anniversary party. Her brother showing up exactly when he did. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Detective Reeves is her brother David. Of course he'd attend her anniversary party. But why that night? Why did he specifically choose to attend that night when he's been working the Pinnacle case for months?" David's voice carried a paranoia that made my skin crawl. "And have you noticed how differently Elena's been acting since then?" "Differently how?" "More interested in my work, asking questions about the office, about my travel schedule. Yesterday she asked if I needed help organizing my files." I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. David's suspicious nature, which had served him well in covering up his crimes, was now turning on me with laser focus. "You're being paranoid," Veronica said, but her voice carried less certainty than before. "Elena adores you. She's spent months planning romantic gestures and trying to rekindle your marriage. She's not exactly criminal mastermind material." "Maybe not," David conceded, "but she doesn't have to be a mastermind if she's just passing information to someone who is." The house fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and I realized they were both processing the implications of David's suspicion. If they decided to test me, to watch me more carefully, my entire operation could collapse. Then Veronica's voice cut through the silence with a suggestion that made my blood freeze. "We could search her things. Her phone, her computer, her car. If she's been communicating with outside parties, there would be evidence. Or," David's voice grew darker, "we could test her, set up a situation where we feed her specific false information, and see if it makes its way back to the investigation." I heard footsteps moving back toward the living room, and I quickly grabbed cleaning supplies from David's desk drawer, preparing to look busy if they came upstairs. But my hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the bottle of wood polish. "David, there's something else." Veronica's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing me to strain to hear through the monitor. "I've been reviewing our security footage from the house. Elena's been spending a lot of time in your office when you're not home." "Doing what?" "I can't tell from the angles, but she's definitely been accessing your desk area multiple times over the past 2 weeks." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a cold determination that terrified me more than anything I'd heard yet. "Cancel our Miami trip next week. We're not going anywhere until we figure out exactly what Elena knows and who she's been talking to." I heard chairs scraping against the floor as they both stood up, and panic shot through my system as I realized they were about to start actively investigating me. Everything I'd worked for, all the evidence I'd gathered, the 43 families waiting for justice. It could all disappear if David and Veronica discovered my real activities. But as I listened to their footsteps moving through the house below me, I realized that their paranoia had just handed me the most dangerous opportunity yet. They were so focused on uncovering my hypothetical betrayal that they weren't protecting themselves from my actual investigation. Because while they planned to test me for loyalty, I was about to give them a test they would never see coming. The next 72 hours became the most carefully orchestrated deception of my life, as I prepared to turn David and Veronica's paranoia into the very trap that would destroy them. While they planned to test my loyalty, I was setting the stage for a confrontation that would expose their crimes in front of the people whose opinions mattered most to them both. Saturday morning, I implemented the first phase of my counterplan by doing something completely unexpected. I told David a carefully constructed version of the truth. "Honey," I said over breakfast, my voice carrying just the right amount of hesitation, "I need to talk to you about something that's been bothering me since the anniversary party." David's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, and I could see Veronica tense from where she sat at our kitchen island, supposedly reviewing work emails but actually monitoring every word of our conversation. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" David's voice was carefully controlled, but I caught the flash of panic in his eyes. "It's about Alexander. Some of the things he said that night. About his investigation at Pinnacle." I twisted my wedding ring nervously, a gesture I'd perfected over years of actual anxiety that now served as perfect camouflage. "David, I'm worried that your company might be in serious trouble." The relief that washed over David's face was almost comical. He thought I was coming to him with concerns, not revelations. "Elena, what exactly did Alexander tell you?" "He mentioned something about patient safety issues and financial irregularities. He seemed to think that people at Pinnacle might be in legal jeopardy." I reached across the table and took David's hand, injecting my voice with wifely concern. "I know how hard you've been working lately, how stressed you've been. I'm terrified that you might somehow get caught up in whatever's happening, even if you haven't done anything wrong." Veronica actually smiled at this performance, clearly buying into the narrative of the worried wife who'd picked up fragments of information and misunderstood their significance. "Sweetheart," David said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd been using with me for months, "you don't need to worry about any of that. Alexander's investigation is focused on a completely different department. The work I do, the work Veronica and I do, is completely legitimate." "But what about those late nights, those emergency meetings, those trips you've been taking?" I let my voice crack slightly, as if I was finally voicing fears I'd been suppressing for weeks. David and Veronica exchanged a look that they thought was subtle, but I caught every nuance of their silent communication. They were deciding how much of their cover story to maintain versus how much truth they could safely reveal. "Elena," Veronica interjected, her voice warm with false sympathy, "I think David and I should probably explain what's really been happening. You deserve to know the truth." This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the moment when their arrogance would lead them to reveal details they thought I couldn't understand or use against them. "The truth is," David began, "we've been working on a special project, a research initiative that requires absolute confidentiality because of competitive concerns. That's why we've been having so many private meetings, why we've been traveling together." "What kind of research?" I asked, widening my eyes with the innocent curiosity they expected from me. "Cancer treatment protocols," Veronica said smoothly. "We're developing revolutionary therapies that could change how oncology works. But if our competitors found out about our methods, they could steal years of research and development." I nodded earnestly, as if this explanation made perfect sense, while internally marveling at how easily they lied about work that had literally killed hundreds of people. "That makes me feel so much better," I said with apparent relief. I was imagining all sorts of terrible scenarios. "But if you're working on something that could help cancer patients, that's wonderful." Over the next 2 days, I used their newfound willingness to share harmless details to extract information that would have taken Alexander months to obtain through official channels. Under the guise of supportive wife wanting to understand her husband's important work, I learned about upcoming meetings with international pharmaceutical executives, planned expansion of their research protocols to facilities in Canada and Mexico, and most crucially, the location and timing of their next major strategy session. "We're having a comprehensive review meeting this Thursday," David explained as we cuddled on the couch Sunday evening, while Veronica pretended to work on her laptop nearby. All the key players from the research initiative will be there. It's the kind of meeting that only happens once every few months. Where are you having it? I asked, stroking his hair with wifely affection. The Grandview Conference Center. Veronica booked the executive suite for privacy. He squeezed my hand. I'm sorry I can't tell you more specific details, but the confidentiality requirements are very strict. What David didn't know was that Alexander had been trying to get surveillance access to Grandview for weeks, but the facility's security and privacy policies made it nearly impossible to monitor without compromising the investigation. Now, thanks to my husband's pillow talk, I could provide not just the location but the exact suite number and timing. Monday morning, while David was in the shower and Veronica had stepped outside to take a private call, I sent Alexander the intelligence through our secure channel. Thursday, 2 p.m., Grandview Conference Center, Executive Suite 12. All key players confirmed attending. His response came back within minutes. Elena, this is perfect. We'll have audio/video surveillance in place. But we need you to stay away from Grandview Thursday. For your safety and to avoid compromising the operation. I stared at that message for a long moment before typing my response. Actually, I have a better idea. What if the devoted wife decided to surprise her hardworking husband with lunch for his important meeting? The pause before Alexander's reply told me he was considering the implications. Elena, that's extremely dangerous. If something goes wrong. Then make sure nothing goes wrong, I typed back. Because I want to be there when they realize that the naive wife they've been lying to for months just handed them to federal agents on a silver platter. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in a blur of final preparations. Thomas Brennan positioned himself with media credentials to cover a, quote, pharmaceutical industry conference at Grandview. Dr. Wolf and Rebecca Martinez prepared to provide expert commentary on the medical evidence once arrests were made. Margaret Chen organized 43 families to be available for immediate press statements about their loved ones who died in Pinnacle's fake trials. By Wednesday night, as I lay in bed next to David while he slept peacefully, believing his wife was safely contained and his secrets were secure, everything was in place for the most public, most devastating exposure of pharmaceutical fraud in recent history. Thursday morning, David kissed me goodbye and told me he loved me, completely unaware that he was about to attend the meeting that would destroy his life and expose every crime he and Veronica had committed. And I was going to be there to watch it happen. Thursday afternoon at 2:47 p.m., I walked into Executive Suite 12 at the Grandview Conference Center, carrying a catered lunch tray and wearing the brightest smile I could manage, while 7 of the most dangerous pharmaceutical executives in the country sat around a mahogany conference table discussing how to expand their empire of medical fraud to international markets. Surprise! I announced cheerfully, setting the lunch tray on the side table as 8 guilty faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from confusion to absolute terror. I thought my hardworking husband and his colleagues could use some fuel for their important research meeting. David's face went through several colors before settling on a sickly gray. Elena, what are you doing here? This is a private meeting. I know, honey, but I wanted to do something special for the team that's working so hard to develop revolutionary cancer treatments. I began unpacking sandwiches and salads, my movements deliberately slow and methodical while I memorized every face around that table. After our conversation this weekend, I realized how little I understood about the incredible work you're all doing to help patients. Veronica, seated to David's right, managed to find her voice first. Elena, that's very thoughtful, but we really do need privacy for this discussion. Perhaps you could leave the food and... Oh, but I brought enough for everyone, I interrupted, continuing to unpack the meal with aggressive cheerfulness. Dr. Harrison, isn't it? From the Phoenix facility? And Dr. Petrosky from the Canadian operations? David's told me so much about your collaborative research efforts. The men around the table exchanged glances that would have been amusing if the situation weren't so deadly serious. They had no idea that every word they'd spoken for the past 47 minutes had been recorded by federal surveillance equipment, or that FBI agents were positioned throughout the conference center. Mrs. Caldwell, Dr. Harrison began carefully, while we appreciate the gesture, this really is a confidential business meeting. Perhaps your husband could bring you up to speed on our research progress later, in a more appropriate setting. I paused in my unpacking, looking directly at him with wide, innocent eyes. Research progress? Oh, you mean the Phoenix trial results? The ones showing such promising outcomes for terminal cancer patients? Now we're reaching the story's actual conclusion. Stay with us and don't skip ahead because the next part is the most interesting yet. The silence that fell over the room was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. David's face had progressed from gray to white, and Veronica's perfectly manicured hands were gripping her portfolio so tightly her knuckles stood out like mountain ranges. "Elena," David said very quietly, "how do you know about Phoenix trial?" "Oh, honey, you mentioned it during one of your phone calls with Veronica. Something about accelerating the timeline because families were asking questions?" I tilted my head with artificial confusion, though I have to admit I was a little surprised when Dr. Martinez called me yesterday. "Dr. Martinez called you?" Veronica's voice cracked slightly on the question. "Well, not Dr. Rebecca Martinez, your medical consultant. Roberto Martinez's widow, Carmen. She had some very interesting questions about her husband's treatment at the Phoenix facility." I set down the last sandwich and turned to face the table directly. Apparently, Ribeiro's autopsy showed no trace of the experimental cancer medication he'd supposedly been receiving for 3 months before his death. Dr. Petrosky, a heavy-set man with nervous eyes, started to stand up. "I think we should postpone this meeting." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I think we should continue. You see, I've been learning so much about pharmaceutical research lately. Did you know that when patients receive placebo treatments instead of real medication, it's supposed to be part of controlled clinical trials with informed consent? It's absolutely fascinating." David was on his feet now, moving toward me with a mixture of panic and rage in his eyes. "Elena, stop talking, right now." "But why, darling? I'm just trying to understand your work better, like those spreadsheets you keep about patient mortality rates and insurance claim processing times. Or that offshore banking system Veronica set up to handle payments from the shell companies." I smiled at each face around the table. "It's all so complicated, but I'm getting the hang of it." The room erupted into chaos as several executives started talking at once, chairs scraping against the floor as people stood up, and David grabbed my arm with enough force to leave bruises. "Who have you been talking to?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. "What have you done?" That's when the conference room doors opened, and Detective Captain Alexander Reeves walked in, followed by 6 FBI agents in full tactical gear. "Elena Caldwell, please step away from the table," Alexander said in his official voice, though I caught the flash of brotherly pride in his eyes. "Gentlemen, ladies, I'm Detective Captain Reeves, Metropolitan Police, working in conjunction with the FBI. You're all under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, and murder in connection with the systematic distribution of falsified medications to terminally ill patients." The next few minutes unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of justice. As agents moved around the table with handcuffs, reading rights, and securing evidence, I watched David and Veronica's faces as they realized the scope of what had just happened. "You," Veronica spat at me as an agent cuffed her hands behind her back, "you've been working with them this whole time." "Actually," I said, my voice finally carrying the cold satisfaction I'd been hiding for weeks, "I've been working against you. Every phone call you thought was private, every document you thought was secure, every plan you made in my living room thinking I was too stupid to understand, I recorded it all." David's voice was barely a whisper as the agent led him toward the door. "Elena, how could you do this to us?" I looked at my husband, my former husband, for what I knew would be the last time. "How could I do this to you? David, you've killed hundreds of people for money." Veronica convinced families to watch their loved ones die, believing they were receiving treatment that would save them. You turned cancer patients into profit margins. As the agents escorted them from the room, Veronica turned back one final time, her composure finally completely shattered. "You have no idea what you've just destroyed. The research we were doing, the lives we could have saved." "The only lives you saved," I called after her, "were the ones who won't die tomorrow because you're finally stopped." The conference room fell silent except for the sound of evidence being collected and cameras clicking as crime scene photographers documented everything. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see news vans already arriving in the parking lot, alerted by Thomas Brennan's carefully timed press release. Alexander approached me as the last of the criminals was led away. "Elena, are you all right?" I looked around the room where 7 people had been planning to expand their empire of medical fraud to international markets, never suspecting that the detective's sister they'd been monitoring was actually monitoring them right back. "I'm perfect," I said, meaning it for the first time in months. "How long until the rest of the network is arrested?" "Coordinated raids are happening right now at 17 locations across 3 states, Alexander replied. "By tonight, the entire pharmaceutical fraud ring will be in federal custody." Outside the conference center, I could see Margaret Chen and other families from the Pinnacle Truth Coalition gathering with reporters, finally ready to tell their stories to a world that would listen. Because while David and Veronica had thought they were attending a private strategy meeting, they'd actually just performed their crimes in front of federal agents, their victims' families, and the national media. And the naive wife they'd spent months manipulating and underestimating had orchestrated every moment of their downfall. Within 6 hours of the arrests at Grandview Conference Center, the pharmaceutical fraud scandal exploded across every major news network in the country, and the immediate fallout exceeded even my most optimistic expectations for justice. I sat in Alexander's office at Metropolitan Police Headquarters, watching the domino effect of consequences unfold in real time across multiple television screens. Breaking news, the anchor on Channel 7 announced, Thomas Brennan's byline appearing at the bottom of the screen. Federal agents have arrested 17 executives from what prosecutors are calling the largest pharmaceutical fraud conspiracy in U.S. history. The scheme allegedly involved giving terminally ill cancer patients placebo treatments while billing insurance companies millions for experimental therapies that never existed. The footage cut to the Grandview Conference Center, where I watched David and Veronica being led away in handcuffs for the second time that day. David's expensive suit was wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, and the confident swagger he'd maintained throughout months of criminal activity had completely vanished. Veronica, meanwhile, was shouting at reporters about, quote, wrongful persecution and misunderstood research, her voice growing more shrill with each desperate claim. "Elena," Alexander said, muting the television, "I need to prepare you for what's about to happen. The media attention is going to be intense, and not all of it will be positive. Some people are going to question your methods, your motivations, even your credibility." I nodded, watching a different channel show footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence from Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals headquarters. I expected that. What matters is that they can never hurt another patient. My phone had been buzzing constantly for the past 3 hours, with calls from reporters, lawyers, and victim advocacy groups. But the call that mattered most came from Dr. Patricia Wolf at Riverside General Hospital. "Elena, I wanted you to know that we've already identified 12 patients currently in Pinnacle's care who were receiving placebo treatments," she said, her voice heavy with urgency. "We're transferring them to legitimate treatment facilities immediately. Those people are going to live because of what you did today." The weight of that statement hit me harder than all the arrests, all the media coverage, all the vindication combined. 12 people who would have died believing they were receiving treatment were now going to get actual medical care, because David and Veronica could no longer poison them with false hope. On the largest television screen, a press conference was beginning outside the federal building. U.S. Attorney Catherine Morrison stepped up to a podium bristling with microphones, her expression grim as she addressed the assembled media. "Today's arrests represent the culmination of an 8-month investigation into systematic healthcare fraud that spans multiple states and has resulted in at least 300 documented deaths, she began. The defendants in this case deliberately gave terminally ill patients placebo treatments while charging insurance companies for expensive experimental therapies. They manipulated clinical trial data, bribed hospital staff to falsify medical records, and established offshore financial networks to hide their profits. The camera panned across the crowd of reporters, and I spotted Margaret Chen standing with a group of other families, each holding photographs of their lost loved ones. When the prosecutor opened the floor for questions, Margaret stepped forward to one of the microphones set up for public comments. "My husband Roberto died believing he was receiving cutting-edge cancer treatment through Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Instead, he was given sugar pills while his cancer spread unchecked for 3 months. Today, justice begins for Roberto and hundreds of other patients who trusted these people with their lives." The press conference continued with technical details about the charges, the scope of the investigation, and the legal proceedings to come. But I was focused on my phone, where messages were pouring in from the 43 families in the Pinnacle Truth Coalition, each expressing gratitude, relief, and a kind of healing that could only come from seeing their loved ones' deaths finally acknowledged and addressed. "Elena," Dr. Rebecca Martinez appeared in Alexander's office doorway, slightly out of breath. "I just came from the federal building. The prosecutors want to meet with you tomorrow to discuss your role as a witness in the trial proceedings." "What kind of role?" "Key witness. Possibly the most important witness they have." Rebecca sat down across from Alexander's desk. "Elena, the evidence you gathered over the past month, the recordings, the documents, the financial records, it's what's going to put all of them away for life. Without your inside access, this would have been a much weaker case." Alexander's desk phone rang, and he answered it with his official voice. "Detective Captain Reeves." "Yes, she's here. I understand. We'll be right there." He hung up and turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Elena, that was the FBI. David and Veronica are both requesting to speak with you." "Speak with me? Why?" "They want to negotiate. Apparently, they think you might be willing to advocate for lighter sentences in exchange for information about other pharmaceutical fraud networks they know about." The audacity of their request left me speechless for a moment. After months of lies, betrayal, and literal murder, they thought I might help them avoid the consequences of their actions. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd ask you. But Elena, there's something else. Veronica specifically mentioned that she has information about threats made against you during the investigation. She claims there were discussions about having you eliminated if you became too much of a security risk." My blood ran cold. "Eliminated?" "She's claiming it was David's idea, that she argued against it. Obviously, she's trying to save herself by implicating him in additional crimes. But if it's true..." I thought about all those nights I'd lain in bed next to David, all those times I'd been alone in the house while gathering evidence, all those moments when I'd felt like I was being watched or followed. They hadn't just been surveilling me as a security risk. They'd been considering me as a potential target. "Do you want to hear what they have to say?" Alexander asked gently. I looked at the television screens showing continued coverage of the arrests, at the photographs of David and Veronica in handcuffs, at the families finally getting their moment to speak truth about their losses. Then I thought about the 12 patients Dr. Wolf was transferring to real treatment facilities, the hundreds more, who would never become victims because this network was finally destroyed. "No," I said firmly. "I don't want to hear anything they have to say. They had months to tell the truth, months to stop killing people for profit. Let them explain their crimes to a jury." My phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. "Turn on Channel 12. You need to see this." We switched to Channel 12, where a breaking news banner announced, "Pharmaceutical fraud whistleblower's identity revealed." My stomach dropped as I realized they were about to broadcast my name and face to the entire country, But instead of feeling fear, I felt something unexpected. Pride. Let the world know that Elena Caldwell, the detective's sister who'd been underestimated by criminals and treated like a naive housewife, had brought down the largest pharmaceutical fraud conspiracy in American history. Because while David and Veronica sat in federal holding cells trying to negotiate their way out of life sentences, patients across the country were being transferred to legitimate treatment facilities, families were finally getting answers about their loved ones' deaths, and the medical community was implementing new safeguards to prevent this kind of systematic murder from ever happening again. The immediate consequences were just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring trials, testimonies, and the long process of legal justice. But tonight, for the first time in months, I would sleep peacefully knowing that no more patients would die from David and Veronica's greed. 2 years after that Thursday afternoon at Grandview Conference Center changed everything, I stood at the podium of the National Healthcare Ethics Conference in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of medical professionals, pharmaceutical executives, and patient advocates who'd gathered to hear about the systemic changes that had emerged from the Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals scandal. Now we're reaching the story's actual conclusion. Stay with us and don't skip ahead because the next part is the most interesting yet. When I discovered my husband's affair, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, I thought I was dealing with a personal betrayal that would destroy my marriage. I had no idea I was uncovering a criminal conspiracy that had been systematically murdering cancer patients for profit. In the front row, Margaret Chen sat with Carmen Martinez and dozens of other family members from the Pinnacle Truth Coalition, their faces reflecting the bittersweet satisfaction of justice finally served. Behind them, Dr. Patricia Wolfe and Dr. Rebecca Martinez nodded encouragingly, their own careers now focused on the patient protection protocols that had emerged from our investigation. The trial proceedings had taken 18 months to complete, but the verdicts were everything we'd hoped for and more. David received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, along with orders to pay $47 million in restitution to victim families. Veronica's sentence was only slightly less severe, 35 years in federal prison and $23 million in financial penalties. The other 15 executives received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years, with the entire network's assets seized and distributed to establish a victim compensation fund. But the real victory, I continued, isn't the prison sentences or the financial penalties. It's the fact that the reforms implemented since the Pinnacle investigation have prevented an estimated 1,200 additional deaths from pharmaceutical fraud across the United States. The audience erupted in applause, but I was thinking about the letter I'd received just that morning from Dr. Jennifer Torres. No relation to Jessica Torres from our original coalition, but a young oncologist working in Phoenix who'd written to thank me for the new oversight protocols that had helped her identify and stop a smaller but similar fraud scheme at her hospital. After my presentation, I walked through the conference center's corridors lined with displays about medical ethics reforms, patient advocacy improvements, and the new whistleblower protection programs that had been established in response to our case. One display showed photographs of the 43 patients whose deaths had originally brought our coalition together, alongside statistics showing the hundreds more who'd survived because of the improved clinical trial monitoring systems now in place. "Elena," Charlotte's voice called out from across the lobby. She approached with Thomas Brennan, both of them beaming with pride. That was incredible. I still can't believe how far this has all come. Thomas, whose Pulitzer Prize-winning series about the Pinnacle investigation had launched his career to national prominence, handed me a newspaper. "You might want to see this. Front page of today's Washington Herald." The headline read, "Pharmaceutical Reform Act passes Senate, creating strictest medical trial oversight in U.S. history." The accompanying article detailed how the legislation, dubbed the quote, Martinez Act after my efforts, and Roberto Martinez's legacy, would require real-time monitoring of all clinical trials, mandatory independent verification of patient treatments, and criminal penalties for executives who knowingly approved fraudulent research. "They named it after you," Charlotte said, squeezing my arm. "They named it after all of us," I corrected, thinking about every family member who'd spoken at trial, every medical professional who'd testified about systemic failures, every patient advocate who'd pushed for stronger protections. My phone buzzed with a message from Alexander, who was now directing a specialized pharmaceutical fraud unit within the FBI. "Just wanted you to know, we used protocols developed from your investigation to bust another network in California. 11 executives arrested, 200+ patients transferred to legitimate treatment. Your work keeps saving lives." As I read his message, I thought about the path that had brought me here. The naive woman who'd planned anniversary parties and worried about romance had evolved into someone who testified before Congress, consulted with medical ethics boards, and spoke at conferences about corporate accountability and patient protection. The transformation hadn't been easy. The media attention following the trial had been intense, with some critics questioning my methods and motivations. David's family had initially blamed me for destroying his life, until the full scope of his crimes became public, and they'd quietly distanced themselves from his actions. There had been death threats from other pharmaceutical executives, worried about their own criminal activities being exposed, requiring federal protection for several months. But there had also been incredible moments of healing and purpose. I'd remarried a kind radiologist named Michael Thornton, who worked with terminal cancer patients and understood the importance of the work I'd become involved in. Our wedding had been attended by dozens of families from the Truth Coalition, turning what could have been a simple ceremony into a celebration of survival and renewal. Elena, Dr. Wolf approached our group carrying a folder of documents. "I wanted to update you on the latest patient outcomes from the protection protocols. We've now identified and transferred over 800 patients who were receiving inadequate or fraudulent treatments at various facilities across the country. 800 lives saved. 800 families who wouldn't have to watch their loved ones die believing they were receiving the best possible care, while actually being slowly poisoned by greed and false hope." Margaret Chen joined our conversation, her face carrying the peace that comes from justice finally served. "Elena, I wanted you to know that Roberto's medical school has established a scholarship in his name for students pursuing medical ethics research. They specifically mentioned that it was inspired by your courage in exposing the truth." As the conference wound down and attendees began making their way home, I stood in the lobby one final time, surrounded by the displays documenting how a personal betrayal had evolved into a movement for systematic change. The woman who'd discovered her husband's affair 2 years ago couldn't have imagined standing here today, knowing that her decision to seek strategic justice instead of emotional revenge had created protections for thousands of future patients. My phone lit up with one final message of the day, this one from an unexpected source, Veronica Ashworth, writing from federal prison. "Elena, I know you'll probably never read this, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what we did was wrong. I hope the families can forgive us someday." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness, and some consequences were too important to soften with sentiment. Because while Veronica sat in prison contemplating her crimes, 800 patients were alive today who might not have been without the reforms that emerged from her downfall. And that was justice enough. Coming up next,